Close your eyes and drift back more than 600 years. Picture a small medieval village tucked between rolling hills, forests, and frozen streams. Night has fallen. The wind whispers through bare branches, rattling wooden shutters and sending frost creeping across the uneven cobblestones. Smoke curls lazily from the chimneys of humble cottages, carrying the scent of peat and burning wood. Life is quiet here, but not peaceful. Winter is long, nights are bitterly cold, and survival depends on every scrap of warmth, every morsel of food, every careful decision made by those who live at the edge of the forest and the edge of society. This is the world of the medieval peasant. There are no blankets from cotton mills, no modern heating, no instant food. Every night families huddle together, trying to fend off the chill that seeps into their bones, relying on fire, ingenuity, and sheer will to make it through until dawn. In this narration, we'll explore how these peasants endured some of the harshest winters Europe had ever seen. We'll step into their cottages, wander through snowy fields, and witness the clever ways they preserved food, kept themselves warm, and faced the dangers of frost, hunger, and illness. You'll learn about their clothing, homes, tools, and the small routines that made life tolerable in a world without comfort. So settle in, let your body relax, and allow your mind to drift as we uncover the quiet, hidden struggle of survival in the coldest nights of medieval Britain. This is history designed to soothe, to intrigue, and, ultimately, to lull you into a calm, sleepy journey through time. The harsh reality of medieval winters. As the sun sinks behind distant hills, the village slowly darkens. The timber-framed cottages huddled together, their thatched roofs dusted with frost. Smoke from chimneys twists into the cold air, a fragile sign of life against the encroaching darkness. Medieval winters were long, cruel, and merciless. There were no central heating systems, no warm homes waiting at the end of the day. Instead, families relied on small hearth fires, often little more than a ring of stones holding burning peat or logs. In larger cottages, a fireplace might sit in the main room, the smoke curling up a rudimentary chimney or sometimes seeping into the living area itself, giving the air a constant acrid taste. The cold penetrated everything. Wooden floors grew icy beneath bare feet. Straw mattresses offered little comfort against freezing nights. Woven wool blankets, often handmade, were precious and thin, barely enough to shield the body from frost that could seep into skin, muscle, and bone. Survival required preparation. Villagers stored firewood meticulously, stacking it carefully under eaves or in small sheds. A miscalculation could mean a night shivering in near darkness, unable to tend the hearth as wind and snow howled outside. Food preservation was equally critical. Meat was salted or smoked, grain stored in sacks, and vegetables kept in cold cellars to prevent rot. Each ration was measured, weighed, and treasured, for a single misstep could bring hunger before spring arrived. Children were particularly vulnerable. They huddled close to their mothers, wrapped in layers of cloth, learning from a young age the rhythm of winter survival, when to move, when to conserve warmth, when to sleep close to the fire. The elderly, too, relied on community care, for age slowed the body's ability to endure frost. Villages functioned like living machines, each member playing a role in survival, from chopping wood to tending animals to sharing warmth when cold crept through the walls. Yet there was resilience here, too. The peasants' ingenuity, their small comforts, and their intimate knowledge of the natural world made winter survivable, even when the nights were harsh. The smoke from the hearth, the warmth of a shared bed, the scent of baking bread, these became lifelines, small but vital, in the darkness. As you listen, imagine the wind moaning outside a timbered wall, snow piling against the door, the faint orange glow of the hearth illuminating tired faces. Picture the peasant family, wrapped in layered wool, huddled together, whispering quietly, sharing stories, and silently calculating the hours until dawn. This is the world of the medieval peasant. Fragile, precarious, yet enduring. And as we move through the following parts, you will see the careful techniques, daily routines, and survival strategies that allowed them to withstand the coldest nights, night after night, year after year. Housing and warmth strategies. In medieval villages, a peasant's house was small, humble, and crafted for necessity rather than comfort. Most cottages were built from wattle and daub, woven sticks plastered with clay, straw, and sometimes animal dung. Roofs were thatched with reeds or straw, insulating against wind and snow, but offering limited protection against deep winter cold. Inside, the structure was simple. One main room served as kitchen, living space, and sleeping area. The hearth, usually placed centrally or along one wall, was the heart of the home. It provided warmth, a place to cook food, and a gathering spot where families huddled together at night. Smoke often filled the room, creating a pungent but life-saving layer that deterred insects and added a bit of insulation.
Windows were rare, small, and sometimes just wooden shutters or oiled cloth stretched over openings. This lack of glass kept the interior drafty but prevented the bitter wind from fully penetrating the walls. Doors were thick and wooden, sometimes reinforced with mud or straw for insulation. To preserve warmth, families slept close together. Parents and children shared straw-filled mattresses or rush-stuffed mats, often covered by layers of woolen blankets. Livestock, such as pigs or chickens, might even be brought indoors during particularly harsh nights, their bodies generating additional heat. The peasant cottage became a living organism where every body, every hearth, every shared blanket contributed to survival. Villagers also used practical techniques to trap heat. Heavy curtains or tapestries could block drafts. Mud plastered on walls offered extra insulation. Floors might be layered with rushes or straw to reduce the chill seeping through earth and ground. In some areas, small clay stoves or iron braziers were used to concentrate heat in one corner, though such luxuries were rare. Nighttime routines revolved around warmth. After the evening meal, families clustered near the fire, tending it constantly. Wood and peat had to be rationed, for a sudden frost could deplete stores before dawn. Stories, songs, and whispered prayers passed the time, providing comfort and distraction from the biting cold. Imagine the scene: a dimly lit room, the orange glow of embers reflecting off walls, a child curled against their mother, the smell of burning peat thick in the air, and the cold wind hissing through gaps in the door. This small, smoky, intimate space was not merely a home, it was a fortress against the merciless winter. The medieval peasant's cottage, modest and fragile as it might appear, was a marvel of adaptation. Every element, the walls, the roof, the hearth, the layering of blankets, worked together to create a sanctuary from the cold. In the coming parts, we will explore food, clothing, and daily survival strategies, revealing how peasants combined ingenuity, endurance, and community to endure the harshest nights of the Middle Ages.
Food and nutrition during cold nights. Survival in the freezing nights of medieval Europe depended as much on what peasants ate as on how they kept warm. Food was both sustenance and a source of internal heat, critical for enduring long, bitter winters. But peasant diets were far from luxurious. They were simple, repetitive, and driven by necessity. Most peasants relied heavily on grains such as rye, barley, oats, and wheat. These were ground into coarse flour to make bread, porridge, or flat cakes. Bread was often dark, dense, and minimally leavened, consumed with butter, cheese, or occasionally a bit of honey. Oat porridge, cooked slowly over the hearth, was a staple at dawn, providing warmth and energy for a day of labor in the cold fields. Vegetables came from small garden plots: cabbage, onions, leeks, turnips, and beans. Root vegetables were particularly valuable in winter, stored in cool, dry cellars or pits to prevent freezing. Some families preserved food through pickling, fermenting, or drying, creating stores that could last through months of snow and frost. Meat was scarce. Livestock like pigs, cows, or chickens were valuable assets, often reserved for breeding or special occasions. When peasants did eat meat, it was usually salted, smoked, or cooked into stews to stretch small portions over several meals. Fish, especially salted or dried herring, supplemented the diet in villages near rivers or coasts. Calories mattered more than variety. During winter, the body needed extra energy to maintain warmth. Porridge, bread, and stews offered dense sustenance, while ale and weak beer were consumed not just for hydration, but because fermented grains provided additional calories. Even a small sip could warm the stomach and lift spirits during long nights. Heating the food itself contributed to survival. Hot soups and stews were kept simmering over the hearth, with families returning repeatedly to ladle small portions. The act of cooking, stoking the fire, chopping vegetables, stirring pots, added physical warmth, keeping hands and bodies moving.
Seasoning was rare. Herbs from gardens or dried wild plants added flavor, while salt was treasured for preservation rather than taste. Sugar was a luxury, imported and expensive, rarely found in a peasant home. Yet even the simplest flavors like onion, garlic, or a sprig of thyme transformed a basic meal into a psychological comfort, offering small relief from the monotony and hardship. Food scarcity forced ingenuity. Peasants learned to stretch meager supplies with thick broths, gruel, or oat cakes baked over coals. Every scrap was valued. Leftover bones were simmered into stock, stale bread was softened in water or milk, weeds and wild plants were gathered to supplement gardens. Imagine a frosty evening. A family huddles around a simmering pot of cabbage and barley stew. Steam curls into the air, mingling with smoke from the hearth. The children hold tin cups of warm ale, while parents ladle thick porridge, passing scraps to a dog lying nearby for warmth. Each bite warms the body and soothes the mind, a small victory against the chill outside. In these moments, food was more than nourishment. It was ritual, resilience, and survival. Eating together strengthened the family bond, provided a sense of security, and allowed peasants to endure the relentless cold of medieval nights.
Clothing and layering for survival. As darkness fell and temperatures plummeted, medieval peasants relied heavily on clothing to stave off the bitter cold. But their options were limited. Fabrics were coarse, production slow, and the materials themselves expensive. Survival often depended on ingenuity, layering, and the careful use of every available scrap of cloth. The base layer for most peasants was simple linen. Linen shirts or shifts were worn next to the skin, providing some insulation while wicking away moisture from sweat. Wool, more common for outer garments, was the essential material for warmth. Peasant homes often had simple woolen tunics, cloaks, and long skirts or trousers. These were heavy, sometimes itchy, but retained heat and blocked wind better than linen alone. Layering was critical. A typical winter outfit might include a linen undergarment, a woolen tunic, and a cloak fastened with a pin or brooch. Hoods or simple hats protected heads and ears, while woolen socks, mittens, or simple gloves kept extremities from freezing. Scarves, made from scraps of cloth, were wrapped around the neck, sometimes covering the lower face. Footwear was rudimentary. Leather boots or shoes were often lined with straw, rags, or animal fur to provide extra warmth. Peasants sometimes wore multiple pairs of socks or even wrapped cloth around their feet to avoid frostbite. Despite these precautions, winter marches across frozen fields could be brutal, and frostbitten toes or fingers were common. Women often added extra layers to skirts, petticoats, and woolen stockings, both for warmth and modesty. Men wrapped themselves in cloaks, sometimes doubling layers for labor in the fields. Children, frequently neglected in clothing, were bundled in whatever scraps were available, often sharing garments with siblings.
Fur was a luxury, but even peasant families might use it selectively. Rabbit pelts, sheepskins, or leftover scraps from butchery could line cloaks, mittens, or boots. These improvised solutions made a significant difference during the harshest nights. Clothing also had social and symbolic importance. A well-maintained tunic indicated relative prosperity, while tattered or patched garments marked poverty. Yet even the poorest peasants prioritized warmth over appearance, sewing patches and layers to trap air and insulation rather than purely for aesthetics. Maintenance was crucial. Wool garments were thick and durable but needed airing, brushing, or occasional washing. Drying clothes near the hearth added warmth to the room, while damp cloths could be stuffed into gaps between layers for extra insulation. Peasants knew that cold combined with wet clothing could be deadly during long nights. Headwear, often overlooked today, was essential. Hoods, coifs, and simple caps protected against frostbite, and many peasants wrapped additional cloth or fur around their heads and necks. The loss of heat through the head could sap the body's warmth quickly, making hats a literal matter of survival. The ingenuity of medieval peasants in clothing cannot be understated. Scarce materials were reused, patched, and layered creatively. Every garment served multiple purposes: protection, warmth, and survival. They wore their resources like armor against the cold, adapting their attire to the harsh realities of medieval winters.
Heating the home, fires, hearths, and nighttime rituals. For medieval peasants, surviving the coldest nights was as much about managing the home as it was about clothing. The hearth was the heart of every dwelling, a source of heat, light, and comfort in an otherwise harsh environment. Yet even a fire could only do so much, and the art of keeping warm was both practical and ritualistic. Peasant homes were simple structures, often one room with walls of wattle and daub or rough stone and a roof of thatch. Insulation was minimal, windows were smaller, covered with oiled cloth, and wind could howl through cracks in timber or stone. The hearth, which was usually centrally placed, provided the main source of warmth. A fire of wood, peat, or straw was carefully tended, with embers kept alive throughout the night. Families gathered around the fire to eat, work, and socialize. The flames provided more than heat, they were central to the rhythm of peasant life. Cooking, repairing tools, spinning wool, and storytelling all took place in the glow of the hearth. At night, the fire became a symbol of survival, its embers guarding against the encroaching cold. Peasants developed clever methods to retain warmth. Straw or rushes were spread on the floor to insulate against cold stone or dirt. Beds were raised off the floor when possible and layered with straw, furs, or extra blankets. Sometimes animals were allowed inside to share their body heat, a practice that brought both warmth and occasional smells that modern readers might find unappealing. Nighttime rituals were intertwined with survival strategies. Families often huddled together under shared blankets or cloaks, conserving heat and reinforcing bonds. Stories or prayers were recited both to pass the time and to ward off fear of the dark. Candles were rare and expensive, so the fire served as the primary light source, flickering shadows across walls as the night deepened.
Cooking fires contributed indirectly to warmth. Stews and porridges simmering over the flames released heat into the room, and the act of preparing food provided motion, keeping bodies warmer before the long hours of sleep. Hot water could be poured into ceramic or metal vessels to serve as primitive hot water bottles, offering localized warmth in beds of straw or fur. Peasants also used building design to mitigate cold. Heaths were often centrally located to maximize heat distribution. Low ceilings trapped warmth, and sleeping platforms might be built against walls to block drafts. Even the arrangement of beds and furniture followed practical logic. The coldest spots were avoided, and the hearth's warmth was maximized for the family's survival. However, winter nights were still brutal. Frost could seep into the home, and icy winds could pierce even the thickest layers of clothing. Smoke from the fire added warmth, but also stung eyes and lungs, a minor discomfort compared to hypothermia. The success of surviving a long, cold night depended on preparation, ingenuity, and constant vigilance. Despite the hardship, these evenings had their own rhythm. The fire was a gathering point, a place of warmth, nourishment, and human connection. Laughter, songs, and whispered tales carried through the night, keeping spirits alive even as temperatures dropped. For peasants, surviving the cold was as much psychological as physical, a combination of strategy, community, and ritual.
Clothing, bedding, and layering, armor against the cold. For medieval peasants, surviving the bitter nights of winter required more than just fire and food. It required clothing, bedding, and clever layering that acted as a personal armor against the cold. Unlike the nobility, peasants could not rely on furs, silk, or multiple woolen coats stitched by expert tailors. Instead, survival depended on practical, durable, and sometimes improvised clothing that could trap warmth and resist the icy winds sweeping through the villages and countryside. Layering was life. Peasants wore linen undergarments next to their skin, shirts and shifts, to absorb sweat and provide a soft barrier. Over these, they added one or more woolen tunics or coats, thick enough to insulate, yet flexible enough for work. Wool was prized not only for warmth, but for its water-resistant qualities, keeping moisture from freezing against the skin. When available, additional layers such as cloaks, capes, or wraps were added for nighttime rest or travel. Hats, hoods, and scarves were indispensable. Hoods lined with fur or wool protected the head and neck, the areas of the body most vulnerable to heat loss. Peasants often used mittens, gloves, and leg wrappings fashioned from scraps of wool or leather. Shoes were typically thick leather boots, sometimes stuffed with straw for insulation, and were often kept dry by mud or grass coverings when snow fell. Every extra layer of fabric was a critical shield against frostbite and hypothermia. Bedding and sleep as survival. Peasants' houses were small, drafty, and often shared with animals to conserve warmth. A typical peasant house contained one main room with a central hearth and a loft or corner where straw mattresses or simple rush-stuffed pallets served as beds. Families clustered together on these beds, sharing body heat during frigid nights. Straw, hay, or rushes were layered thickly to create insulation between the cold floor and the sleeper. Blankets were rare for the poorest, so peasants often used layers of old clothing, furs scavenged from hunting, or hides to cover themselves. For those near rivers or forests, moss, reeds, and dried leaves could be stuffed into sacks for additional padding. Survival depended on ingenuity. Every soft layer could mean the difference between waking healthy or succumbing to the cold. Practical adaptations. Peasants also relied on simple innovations to make clothing and bedding more effective. Wet clothing was removed and dried near the fire, boots were stuffed with straw at night, and woolen wraps were tied tightly to trap body heat. Even children were bundled tightly, sometimes in multiple small layers, to prevent dangerous heat loss.
Winter was a time when clothing served as both utility and social indicator. Richer peasants might afford dyed wool or additional layers, while the poorest relied on patchwork garments, mending clothes repeatedly to prevent holes that could let in drafts. Yet regardless of wealth, all peasant households learned to maximize warmth from what they had. The hearth as centerpiece. No peasant clothing or bedding strategy worked without the hearth. Fires were tended constantly, both for cooking and for heat. Nightly routines often involved gathering fuel, maintaining embers, and positioning beds near the fire. The glow of the hearth became the lifeline of the family, radiating warmth into clothing and bedding, and creating pockets of safety in the bitter cold. In essence, survival during the coldest nights of medieval life was a complex dance between clothing, bedding, and fire. Each layer of fabric, each straw-filled mattress, each flicker of flame was a piece of armor, a tool of endurance, and a testament to human resilience in the face of relentless winter.
Heating the home, hearths, fires, and ingenuity. For medieval peasants, warmth was a constant concern. The bitter winters of the Dark Ages were not tempered by modern heating systems, insulated walls, or even glass windows. Instead, survival relied heavily on the ingenuity, routines, and daily labor required to maintain a warm hearth. Fire was life, and managing it was an art, a science, and a necessity all at once. The hearth is the heart of the home. In every peasant house, the hearth was the central feature. It provided heat for cooking, light in the long winter nights, and a gathering place for families huddled together. Most homes contained a single room where the hearth occupied the center or a corner. Smoke from the fire often escaped through a hole in the roof or small openings in the walls, as chimneys were rare. Maintaining a fire required constant attention. Families stored wood carefully, chopping logs in the warmer months and stacking them to dry. Peasants often supplemented wood with peat, dried dung, or branches, depending on what was locally available. Each material burned differently, requiring skill to create a steady flame. Wet or green wood produced smoke but little warmth, while dry wood could burn too quickly if not managed properly. Sleeping near the hearth. The placement of beds and sleeping areas was dictated by the hearth. Families would sleep close to the fire, often on raised platforms or beds lined with straw and rags to absorb as much warmth as possible. Children and the elderly, most vulnerable to cold, were given priority spots. Sharing body heat was another critical strategy, with multiple family members huddling together under blankets, furs, or patched garments.
Improvisation against the cold. Peasants developed creative methods to retain warmth. Doors and windows were often covered with animal hides, woven reeds, or heavy cloth to block drafts. Floors were layered with straw or rushes, which acted as insulation against the icy ground. During particularly harsh nights, small clay or metal containers called foot stoves might be filled with embers and placed near the feet of sleepers, radiating heat slowly. Community and shared resources. In some villages, peasants pooled resources for warmth. Shared ovens, communal fires, or even simple meeting spots allowed villagers to warm themselves before returning to their homes. For the poorest, proximity to neighbors' fires could make the difference between life and death during particularly severe cold snaps. The fire's role beyond heat. The hearth was more than warmth. It was survival, safety, and sustenance. Cooking meals near the fire reduced the labor of heating separate spaces. Hot meals and drinks helped stave off hypothermia. The hearth also served as a focal point for storytelling, social bonds, and the transmission of knowledge, lessons in survival, winter lore, and practical techniques for enduring the cold. In essence, managing the hearth required constant vigilance, knowledge of fuels, and clever adaptation. Without it, even well-clothed and well-fed peasants faced the grim prospect of frostbite, illness, or death.
Food preservation and winter rations fuel for the body. In the freezing winters of medieval Europe, surviving the cold wasn't only about staying warm, it was equally about having enough food to sustain energy. For peasants, food scarcity was a constant threat, and preserving enough provisions to last through long, harsh nights required planning, ingenuity, and sometimes sheer luck. Harvesting and storage. The success of a winter depended heavily on the harvest. Peasants grew staple crops like barley, rye, oats, and wheat, often storing dried grains in straw-lined pits, wooden bins, or ceramic containers. Grains could be ground into flour for bread, porridge, or cakes, providing slow-burning energy to sustain bodies during laborious days. Root vegetables, turnips, carrots, parsnips, and onions were stored in cellars, pits, or layered in straw to prevent freezing. Apples and other hardy fruits could be dried or fermented into cider, which also helped provide calories and some nutrients. Preserving meat and fish. Meat was a rare luxury for peasants, often reserved for festival days or barter exchanges. When available, preservation was key. Salting, smoking, and drying were common techniques. Hams, salted pork, and smoked fish could last through the cold months, providing concentrated nutrition. Peasants might also keep small livestock, chickens, pigs, or goats, inside stables or barns, both for warmth and for a food source. Fish, especially in communities near rivers, lakes, or coasts, was dried or smoked to ensure survival. Salt was a precious commodity used sparingly but carefully to extend the shelf life of protein.
Porridges and stews, the daily staples.
The most common winter meals were simple porridges or stews made from grains, legumes, and whatever vegetables were on hand. Cooked over the central hearth, these dishes provided calories, warmth, and hydration. Herbs grown in small gardens or collected from nearby woods added flavor and sometimes medicinal benefits. Peasants often ate 2 meals a day, a substantial breakfast of porridge or bread with ale or small beer, and a dinner of stew or pottage. Supper might be minimal, with only bread, cheese, or a bowl of grain depending on availability. Rationing and resource management. Scarcity demanded strict rationing. Families had to carefully calculate their provisions to last until the spring thaw. Hasty consumption during early winter could leave households starving later. Children often ate less than adults, and elders sometimes sacrificed their portion for the young, reflecting both pragmatism and compassion. Communal storage, where villagers pulled surplus grains or preserved foods, could make the difference between survival and starvation. Wealthier peasants might sell or lend food to neighbors, ensuring reciprocal support in extreme weather. Foraging and supplementary food. When supplies ran low, peasants turned to the forests, marshes, and fields. Nuts, berries, and wild herbs supplemented diets, while roots and bark were occasionally used in extreme desperation. Hunting small game rabbits, birds, or squirrels provided additional protein, though it was risky and required knowledge of traps, snares, and seasonal patterns. Even with careful planning, winter was a time of lean meals. Hunger was common, and the combination of cold and malnutrition made peasants more vulnerable to illness. Survival depended not just on food itself, but on the disciplined foresight and communal networks that kept families fed when the landscape turned harsh.
Clothing and layering armor against the cold, surviving the bitter cold of medieval winters required more than just food and fire. It demanded clothing that could trap warmth, protect from wind, and endure daily labor. For peasants who had neither wealth nor access to luxury textiles, dressing for winter was an exercise in practicality, ingenuity, and resourcefulness. Layering a strategy. Layering was the cornerstone of winter survival. Peasants typically wore multiple layers of coarse wool or linen. A basic winter outfit might include undergarments, linen shirts or shifts worn directly against the skin to wick moisture away from sweat and provide a soft layer beneath rougher fabrics. Middle layers, woolen tunics or dresses added insulation. Wool was prized because it retained warmth even when damp, unlike linen. Outer layers, cloaks, mantles, or long coats shielded wearers from wind, rain, and snow. These were often lined with additional wool, straw, or furs when available. Even the poorest peasants would attempt at least 2 layers, sometimes 3, to trap body heat. Children, due to their vulnerability, might wear patched or hand-me-down garments that had been layered for warmth by their elders. Materials and textiles. Wool was the primary material for winter clothing. Sheep were widespread, and spinning, weaving, and knitting were essential household skills. Peasants often produced their own garments using hand looms or simple frames to weave cloth. Linen made from flax was also common but less insulating. Linen undergarments were worn for comfort, while wool provided the protective barrier. When wealth allowed, furs, especially sheepskin or rabbit, were added to collars, cuffs, and hems, offering extra warmth.
Footwear and extremities. Cold toes and fingers could mean frostbite or illness. Leather shoes or boots were standard, often lined with straw, wool, or cloth scraps for insulation. In extreme cold, peasants might wrap feet in extra layers of cloth or wear multiple pairs of socks. Gloves were rare among the poorest, but mittens, often knitted from wool, could make a significant difference. Hats and hoods were equally crucial. Woolen caps, hoods attached to cloaks, or fur-lined headgear helped retain heat and shield faces from icy wind. Peasants understood that protecting the head and neck conserved body warmth. Improvised warmth. Resourcefulness was essential. Some peasants stuffed clothing with straw or dried moss to create makeshift insulation. Animal skins or discarded furs were patched into garments, especially for children or the elderly. These improvisations could mean the difference between surviving a harsh night or succumbing to hypothermia. Cultural practices and winter customs. Winter clothing was not only functional but also culturally informed. Peasants often repaired and repurposed garments for generations. Patches, embroidery, or woven designs might indicate family or village origin. Clothing also reflected social hierarchy. Wealthier peasants had access to dyed wool or finer weaves, while poorer villagers relied entirely on Hun-spun, natural-colored wool. Challenges and limitations. Despite these strategies, clothing could never fully eliminate the hardships of medieval winters. Dampness, wind, and physical labor created constant challenges. Wet garments froze overnight, and mended clothing wore thin with repeated use. Illness, particularly respiratory infections, thrived in conditions where warmth was scarce and hygiene limited. Even with layered garments, peasants often huddled together in homes, barns, or shared shelters to conserve heat. They relied on both clothing and community to survive, knowing that isolation in the cold could be deadly.
Fire and hearth, the center of winter survival. For medieval peasants, the hearth was far more than a place to cook. It was the central lifeline against the bitter cold. Fire offered warmth, light, and a sense of security in a world where winter nights could stretch unbroken and frigid for hours. Yet creating and maintaining a fire was no simple task. It required labor, skill, and constant vigilance. Hearth construction and placement. Peasant homes were typically small, often consisting of a single room or a two-room cottage. The hearth was built at the center or along the main wall, constructed of stone or clay, with a simple fire pit or a raised platform for pots. Its placement was strategic, central warmth, positioned to radiate heat across the room. Cooking efficiency, allowed for easy preparation of meals and heating of water. Safety, reduced the risk of accidental fires spreading to thatched roofs or wooden walls. Some homes had smoke holes in the roof, while others relied on small openings or gaps in the walls to vent smoke. This meant interiors were often thick with soot, and peasants had to balance warmth with air quality. Fuel sources. Wood was the primary fuel, gathered from nearby forests, hedgerows, or communal lands. Peasants often cut small branches or collected fallen wood to avoid overharvesting. In regions where wood was scarce, peat, dried dung, or straw was used as alternative fuel.
Peat, cut from bogs, dried, and burned slowly, giving long-lasting heat. Dung, from cattle or horses, dried and used sparingly. It produced warmth, but a strong odor. Straw, supplemented fires but burned quickly, often used for kindling rather than sustained heat. Maintaining fuel required constant work. Peasants spent daylight hours gathering, chopping, and drying wood or other fuels in preparation for the long winter nights. Cooking and warmth combined. The hearth served dual purposes, cooking meals and warming the household. Pots of pottage, gruel, or soups simmered over the fire, providing both nutrition and radiating heat. Small ovens or clay hearth extensions allowed for baking bread or roasting root vegetables. Even simple tasks like boiling water for washing doubled as a source of heat. The warmth from cooking stoked fires and helped dry damp clothing and bedding. Communal huddling. Because peasants lived in small, sparsely insulated homes, conserving heat often meant physical closeness. Families huddled around the fire, sharing blankets, straw, or furs. Livestock, when small and manageable, might be brought inside during the harshest nights, providing both warmth and protection. Children and the elderly were especially dependent on proximity to the hearth. Mothers often carried infants close to the body, layered under clothing, while older family members sat nearest to the fire.
Nighttime strategies. As darkness fell, peasants adopted additional measures to preserve heat through the night. Bed placement, sleeping close together on straw-filled mattresses or rush-strewn floors. Layering bedding, using multiple blankets, furs, or additional straw. Fire management, keeping a small, sustainable fire burning until bedtime with embers banked to last until morning. Even with these efforts, temperatures inside the cottages could drop dramatically, especially in harsh northern winters. Survival often depended on the ability to endure discomfort, ration fuel, and work collaboratively as a household. Symbolism and social importance. The hearth wasn't just practical, it was a symbol of survival and domestic life. Stories, songs, and traditions often centered around the fire, with evenings spent weaving, mending, and telling tales. For peasants, the hearth represented safety, family, and the fragile warmth that allowed life to continue through the coldest nights. Food, storage, and winter diets. Surviving the harsh winters of medieval Europe required careful planning, frugality, and knowledge passed down through generations. For peasants, access to food wasn't just about satisfying hunger, it was a matter of survival, especially when frost and snow made farming impossible for months. Winter stores, preservation, and planning. Peasants spent the warmer months preparing for the cold. Summer and autumn harvests had to be carefully managed to ensure there would be enough food through winter. Grains, wheat, barley, oats, and rye were harvested and stored in sacks, clay pots, or wooden bins. These grains were the backbone of the peasant diet, used to make bread, porridge, and gruel. Storage was tricky. Grain had to be protected from moisture, rodents, and insects. Root vegetables, turnips, carrots, parsnips, and onions were buried in cold storage pits, clay-lined cellars, or covered with straw to preserve them. These hardy vegetables could last for months if stored properly. Dried legumes, beans, peas, and lentils were dried for long-term storage. They provided crucial protein during winter months when meat was scarce. Meat, dairy, and protein sources. Most peasants could not afford regular meat. Instead, they relied on small livestock, occasional hunting, and dairy products. Pork and beef, typically reserved for special occasions or barter.
Salted or smoked meat could last longer, but it was a luxury rather than a staple. Poultry and eggs. Chickens and ducks were a common protein source, providing eggs for daily meals. Cheese and milk from cows, goats, or sheep was turned into cheese or butter to extend its shelf life. Cheese was a crucial protein and fat source through the cold months. Preservation techniques. Without modern refrigeration, peasants relied on several preservation methods. Salting and smoking. Meat and fish were salted or smoked to prevent spoilage. This method allowed peasants to stock protein for weeks or months. Drying. Fruits, vegetables, and legumes were dried in the sun or over low fires. Drying removed moisture, preventing decay. Fermentation. Sauerkraut and pickled vegetables were common, providing nutrients and flavor during long winters. Daily winter diets. A typical winter day for a peasant might include morning, a bowl of hot porridge made from oats or barley, sometimes sweetened with honey or dried fruits. Midday, leftover bread, cheese, or gruel, often eaten with preserved vegetables. Evening, pottage, a thick stew made from grains, legumes, vegetables, and occasionally meat or fish if available, cooked over the hearth. Diet was monotonous but designed for caloric efficiency and warmth. High-fat foods like butter, lard, and cheese helped peasants withstand the cold, while hot meals around the hearth provided both nutrition and comfort. Barter, communal sharing, and scarcity. Food security in winter wasn't guaranteed. Families often bartered with neighbors, exchanged surplus grain or dairy for meat or vegetables, or shared communal ovens for baking bread. When stores ran low, ingenuity became essential. Foraging. Roots, wild herbs, and nuts were scavenged from nearby forests or fields. Soup from scraps. Vegetable peels, bones, and small cuts of meat were simmered into nutrient-rich broths. Rationing. Families carefully measured portions, ensuring that everyone had at least enough to survive the night. The social and cultural role of food. Even in scarcity, mealtime was central to family life. Gathering around the hearth for a shared bowl of pottage fostered closeness, storytelling, and the passing of survival knowledge. In winter, every meal was a small victory against the cold, hunger, and hardship. Clothing and layering. Keeping warm in the freezing cold. Winter in medieval Europe was relentless. Snow, ice, and bitter winds made survival a daily struggle, and clothing was the primary defense against hypothermia. For peasants, garments were not fashion statements, they were lifelines. Every layer, every stitch, and every piece of fabric had a practical purpose. Basic garments. Peasants had a limited wardrobe, often inherited or patched over many years. Typical clothing included undergarments. Linen shirts and shifts were worn closest to the skin. Linen was breathable, allowed for sweat to evaporate, and provided a base layer that could be worn under multiple garments. Tunic or dress. A simple wool tunic or dress was worn over the undergarment. Wool was preferred because it retained heat even when damp. Men's tunics reached the knees, while women wore longer dresses.
Hose and stockings, woolen leggings covered the legs. For added warmth, multiple layers were sometimes worn, tied with cords to prevent slipping. Layering techniques. Peasants understood the power of layering to trap heat. Base layer, linen or thin wool shirts to wick moisture away from the skin. Middle layer, thicker woolen tunics or dresses for insulation. Outer layer, cloaks, capes, or coats made from heavy wool or animal skins, often lined with fur for extra warmth. Layering allowed peasants to adjust to indoor and outdoor conditions. Indoors near the hearth, layers could be removed. Outdoors, every layer was crucial for survival. Footwear and extremities. Frostbite was a real danger, so protecting hands and feet was essential. Shoes and boots made from leather, sometimes lined with straw or cloth for insulation. Poor quality shoes often meant frozen toes in winter. Socks and wraps. Wool socks were common, and additional cloth or straw was stuffed inside footwear for extra warmth. Gloves and mittens, rare and valuable. Gloves were often made from scraps of leather or wool. Peasants improvised with cloth wrappings when gloves were unavailable.
Head coverings. Hats, hoods, or simple caps were worn to retain body heat, as a significant amount of warmth is lost through the head. Materials and resourcefulness. Peasants had limited access to high-quality textiles. Wool, the most common and practical material for warmth. Sheep were tended for wool, and spinning, weaving, and felting were vital skills. Linen, used for undergarments, sheets, and wraps. Linen was cooler than wool, preventing overheating indoors. Fur. The wealthy had fur-lined garments, but peasants occasionally salvaged rabbit, fox, or other animal pelts for added insulation. Patchwork. Clothing was patched and mended repeatedly. No scrap of wool or linen was wasted. Even worn-out garments could become quilts, linings, or smaller clothing items. Practical adaptations. Survival often required creativity. Double layering tunics. Two tunics could be worn together, trapping air between layers for better insulation. Hooded cloaks. Multi-purpose garments that kept rain, snow, and wind off the body while allowing free movement. Straw insulation. Some peasants stuffed straw into clothing, shoes, or bedding to retain heat during freezing nights. Clothing is status and necessity. While clothing protected against the cold, it also marked social status.
Peasants wore muted colors, often brown, gray, or off-white. Bright dyes were expensive and reserved for wealthier townsfolk or nobility. Yet functionality always outweighed fashion. Survival dictated every stitch.
Heating and hearths. How peasants stayed warm indoors. As winter nights descended on medieval villages, the hearth became the heart of every peasant home. It was far more than a place to cook. It was the primary source of warmth, light, and survival. Without modern insulation, central heating, or thermal windows, peasants relied on the fire to endure freezing temperatures. The central hearth. Most peasant homes were simple, one-room structures made of wattle and daub or timber with thatched roofs. The hearth was usually located in the center of the room. Construction, a stone or clay pit, often lined with bricks, held the fire. Fuel, wood was the primary fuel, supplemented with peat or straw when available. Managing fuel efficiently was a daily challenge. Every log burned had to be carefully rationed. Smoke management, chimneys were rare. Smoke often escaped through thatched roofs or small openings, causing smoke-filled rooms but providing some protection against insects. The hearth radiated warmth to the room, and peasants positioned sleeping mats, benches, and working areas around it to maximize heat exposure. Firewood and resource management. Survival through the coldest nights required careful planning. Gathering and storage. Families collected firewood in autumn to ensure a steady supply through winter. Dry wood was essential, as wet wood smoked excessively and produced less heat.
Fuel rationing. Fires were kept small and slow burning at night to conserve wood while maintaining enough warmth to prevent hypothermia. Sharing resources. In tightly knit villages, neighbors sometimes shared wood or coordinated collection to ensure no household went entirely without heat. Indoor life and hearth techniques. The hearth dictated daily life. Cooking and heating combined. Meals were prepared over the same fire that heated the room. Soups, stews, and porridges not only nourished, but also contributed to warmth. Beds near the fire. Sleeping arrangements were often organized to maximize warmth. Beds, pallets, or straw mattresses were positioned close to the hearth, and families huddled together for shared body heat. Reflecting warmth. Some homes used simple stone or clay structures around the hearth to radiate heat more effectively. Blankets, furs, and layers of straw on the floor trapped residual warmth. Clothing and hearth synergy. Even indoors, peasants rarely removed layers. Nighttime layering. Woolen garments and cloaks were worn even while sleeping, providing insulation when the fire burned low. Improvised insulation. Straw, old rags, or animal skins were layered over bedding or placed under sleeping mats to keep cold from creeping in from the earthen floor. Hearth as social center. Beyond warmth, the hearth was a hub of community and family life.
Storytelling and traditions. Children listened to tales and folk stories by the fire, passing down oral history during long winter nights. Crafting and chores. Peasants used hearthlight and heat to perform essential indoor tasks such as sewing, mending clothes, and preparing food for storage. Safety and protection. The fire kept away wild animals and deterred disease-carrying pests, providing both physical and psychological security. The survival of medieval peasants in freezing nights was a combination of ingenuity, resourcefulness, and community. While the hearth provided warmth, it was the careful layering of clothing, bedding, and constant vigilance over fuel that ensured families endured the harsh winters. Food preservation and winter diets. Winter in medieval villages was not just cold, it was a time of scarcity. Fields lay barren under frost, rivers froze, and hunting became difficult. Peasants had to plan months ahead to ensure they had enough food to survive the harshest nights. Harvest and storage. Autumn was critical. Grain and bread. Peasants harvested wheat, rye, barley, or oats, then stored the grains in dry, elevated granaries to prevent rot and pests. Bread, the staple of life, was baked and consumed in cycles, often hard and long-lasting to endure the winter months. Root vegetables. Carrots, turnips, parsnips, and onions were stored in cool, dark cellars or buried in straw-filled pits. These roots could last for months if properly protected from moisture and frost. Preserving fruits. Apples, pears, and other hardy fruits were dried or stored in cool, ventilated areas. Some villages fermented fruits into cider or preserved them in honey. Meat, fish, and protein sources. Protein was scarcer than grain. Salting and smoking. Meat from pigs, cows, or sheep was salted, smoked, or cured to prevent spoilage. Fish, especially in coastal or riverside villages, was also preserved through smoking or pickling. Hunting and trapping. Villagers occasionally supplemented diets with rabbits, birds, or wild game, though access to forests was often restricted by local lords. Legumes. Beans, peas, and lentils provided essential protein and were easily stored through winter.
daily rations, and winter diets. Peasant meals were simple but strategically planned. Porridge and soups. A typical dinner consisted of pottage, a thick savory soup made from grains, legumes, vegetables, and occasionally meat or fish. Bread and cheese. Bread was eaten with cheese or small amounts of butter if available. Often bread was dipped in broth to make it last longer. Beverages. Ale or small beer were common. Fermented drinks were safer than water, which could harbor bacteria or freeze in cold nights. Techniques for survival. Winter survival depended on making the most of available resources. Rationing. Families carefully rationed bread, porridge, and stored vegetables to last the months of scarcity. Children and elderly often ate smaller portions to extend supplies.
Fermentation and pickling. Sauerkraut, pickled vegetables, and fermented grains helped maintain nutrition when fresh food ran out. Communal sharing. Villagers sometimes pooled resources to help families in extreme need, fostering survival through community support. Psychological and cultural aspects. Food scarcity shaped social and mental life. Festivals and feasts, major holidays like Christmas and Michaelmas, were celebrated with slightly larger meals or meat consumption, marking relief from the hardest days of winter. Folk knowledge. Herbs, roots, and berries were not just food, they had medicinal uses. Knowledge of edible wild plants was essential for survival. Peasants survived the coldest nights not only with clothing and hearth fires, but also by carefully managing and preserving food. The winter diet was a delicate balance of nourishment, rationing, and ingenuity. Clothing and layering, insulation against the cold. When the frost settled over fields and villages, survival depended as much on clothing as on food. Peasants in medieval times had no central heating, insulated homes, or modern fabrics. Every layer, every stitch, and every bit of wool could mean the difference between warmth and deadly cold. Materials and fabrics. Peasant clothing was practical, functional, and made from locally available materials. Wool. The most common fabric, wool was thick, warm, and somewhat water-resistant. Entire garments, including tunics, cloaks, and hats, were made from wool. Finer wool might be reserved for wealthier peasants. Linen. Used for undergarments and shirts, linen was lighter, soft against the skin, and could absorb sweat while allowing for some ventilation. Furs and hides. During harsh winters, furs and animal hides provided crucial insulation. Sheep, goat, and rabbit pelts were often sewn into linings or used as cloaks. Layering for warmth. Peasants relied heavily on layering to trap heat and maintain body warmth. Undergarments. Linen shirts or shifts formed the base layer, protecting skin from rough woolen garments above. Tunic. A wool tunic over the shirt provided primary insulation and could reach the knees for extra warmth. Leg coverings. Woolen hose or leg wraps kept the legs insulated. In extreme cold, multiple layers were wrapped around the calves. Cloaks and mantles. Heavy woolen cloaks, sometimes lined with fur, shielded peasants from wind, snow, and rain. Cloaks were often fastened with simple wooden or metal brooches.
Head and hands. Wool caps, hoods, and mittens or gloves were essential. The head and hands lost heat quickly, so covering them was a priority. Practical considerations. Peasants adapted clothing for mobility and work. Durability. Garments were patched and mended repeatedly. Every scrap of fabric was valuable, and clothing could be repaired dozens of times before being discarded. Multi-purpose use. Cloaks served as blankets at night. Hoods could double as protection against rain, wind, or snow. Layer adjustment. Peasants removed or added layers depending on activity. Digging in fields required flexibility, while standing outside in cold rain demanded full layering. Footwear and cold protection. Feet were especially vulnerable to frostbite. Shoes. Basic leather shoes or boots, often stuffed with straw for insulation, protected against frozen ground. Socks and wraps. Wool socks or cloth wrappings added warmth. Peasants frequently layered multiple wrappings for long nights outdoors. Social and cultural significance. Clothing also reflected status and identity. Color and decoration. Most peasants wore undyed wool or linen in earthy tones, browns, grays, and muted greens. Bright colors were rare and indicated slightly higher wealth. Seasonal adaptation. Garments were heavier in winter, and lighter tunics were saved for summer months. Old, lighter clothing could be layered under heavier winter pieces. Community knowledge. Families taught children how to layer properly, how to patch clothing efficiently, and how to keep garments dry during snowstorms. Survival in the coldest nights required creativity, thrift, and intimate knowledge of the body's needs. Every layer of wool, linen, or fur was a shield against frost, a crucial investment in life itself. Peasants lived in a constant battle against cold, and their clothing was their first line of defense.
Heating the home, hearths, fires, and warmth. For medieval peasants, warmth wasn't a luxury, it was essential for survival. With no central heating, insulation, or modern fireplaces, every home's design and every fire served a critical function in enduring the coldest nights. The central hearth. The hearth was the heart of the peasant home. Location. Typically in the center of a single-room dwelling, the hearth provided the most consistent source of heat. Fuel. Wood was the primary fuel, but peat, dry dung, and straw could supplement when wood was scarce. Peasants gathered fuel throughout the year, storing it carefully for winter. Function. Beyond warmth, the hearth was used for cooking, boiling water, drying clothes, and sometimes heating stones or pots for beds. Home construction and insulation. Peasant homes were simple but adapted to retain as much heat as possible. Walls. Wattle and daub or timber walls were thick but not perfectly insulated. Families often hung animal hides or tapestries to reduce drafts. Roofs. Thatched roofs provided some insulation, though they could leak during heavy snow or rain. Straw or rush mats inside the house helped retain warmth. Floors. Floors were often dirt, sometimes covered with straw to reduce the cold from below. Straw also served as bedding and insulation for both people and animals. Techniques to maximize heat. Peasants relied on ingenious methods to stretch the limited warmth.
Shared heat. Families slept close together, often on straw mattresses piled near the hearth. Children, adults, and sometimes animals shared the space to preserve body heat. Portable warmth. Hot stones or bricks heated in the fire were wrapped in cloth and placed near the bed or under blankets. Windbreaks. Small interior walls, screens, or hanging cloths helped block drafts in larger homes. Fires in daily life. Maintaining a fire was a full-time responsibility. Nighttime vigilance. Fires were kept burning overnight. If extinguished, restarting them could be a difficult task, especially during heavy snow or rain. Cooking and heat. Cooking was always tied to warmth. A large pot of stew over the fire not only provided nourishment, but also released heat into the room. Community strategies. In villages, peasants sometimes gathered in communal halls or barns during extreme cold to share warmth. Challenges and dangers. Living close to the fire came with risks. Smoke inhalation. With little ventilation, smoke from wood or peat fires often filled the home, causing respiratory issues. Fire hazards. Thatched roofs and wooden walls made accidental fires deadly. Constant vigilance was required. Limited fuel. Harsh winters could deplete fuel stores, forcing peasants to ration heat carefully. Surviving the coldest nights required careful planning, efficient use of resources, and a deep understanding of one's home and hearth. Every fire maintained was a lifeline, every straw mat a layer of protection, and every body huddled near the hearth contributed to the survival of the household.
Food and nutrition, staying energized in freezing conditions. In medieval Britain, the coldest nights weren't just a test of warmth, they were a test of survival. To endure frost and snow, peasants needed sustenance that provided both energy and heat. Food wasn't merely about taste, it was about survival, endurance, and preparing the body to withstand long, bitter nights. Staple foods of the peasantry. Peasants relied on simple, hearty foods that could last through winter. Grains, barley, oats, and rye formed the backbone of the diet. These were often made into porridge, bread, or gruel. Thick gruel was easy to prepare and provided slow-burning energy. Vegetables. Cabbage, turnips, onions, and leeks were common. Root vegetables, stored in cellars or pits, were crucial winter staples. Legumes. Peas, beans, and lentils added protein and bulk to meals. They were dried for preservation and cooked slowly to release nutrients. Meat and fish. Meat was rare for peasants. On special occasions or for wealthier villagers, salted pork or bacon might appear. Fish, specially salted or smoked, was more common, particularly in regions near rivers of the coast. Preservation and storage. Food had to survive long winters, so preservation techniques were essential. Salting and smoking. Meat and fish were salted or smoked to last months.
Root cellars. Underground storage pits insulated vegetables from freezing. Drying. Herbs, fruits, and legumes were dried to prevent spoilage. Fermentation. Some communities fermented cabbage or grains for both nutrition and preservation. Meals to generate warmth. Winter meals were designed to fuel the body and maintain heat. Stews and pottages, thick stews, often containing barley, vegetables, and occasional meat, were slow cooked over the hearth. The hot broth warmed both body and home. Hot drinks, ale, small beer, weak beer, or broth were consumed regularly. Warm drinks provided comfort and hydration when water froze or was unsafe. Calorie-dense ingredients. Fat was prized. Butter, lard, and animal fat were scarce, but used strategically to increase caloric intake, essential for enduring cold nights. Challenges of winter nutrition, surviving the cold was more than eating, it was about combating scarcity. Food shortages. Harsh winters could destroy crops and prevent foraging, leading to hunger or famine. Nutritional deficiencies. Limited variety in diet led to scurvy, rickets, or other deficiencies. Labor and caloric needs. Peasants performed hard labor, plowing, chopping wood, tending animals, which demanded a high caloric intake just to maintain body heat.
Community sharing and cooperation. Peasants often relied on social bonds to survive. Shared meals. Neighbors sometimes pooled resources to ensure that the most vulnerable, children, widows, and the elderly, had enough to eat. Bartering and trade. Grains, eggs, and dairy were traded within villages or with traveling merchants to supplement scarce supplies. Winter nights demanded not only warmth, but also nourishment. The ability to store, prepare, and consume energy-rich foods determined whether a peasant household could survive until spring. Every stew, every loaf of bread, and every sip of ale was part of the strategy to endure the freezing months. Clothing and layering, fighting the cold from the outside. Surviving the bitter nights of medieval Britain required more than food. It required ingenious clothing strategies.
Added protein and bulk to meals. They were dried for preservation and cooked slowly to release nutrients. Meat and fish. Meat was rare for peasants. On special occasions or for wealthier villagers, salted pork or bacon might appear. Fish, especially salted or smoked, was more common, particularly in regions near rivers of the coast. Preservation and storage. Food had to survive long winters, so preservation techniques were essential. Salting and smoking. Meat and fish were salted or smoked to last months.
Root cellars. Underground storage pits insulated vegetables from freezing. Drying. Herbs, fruits, and legumes were dried to prevent spoilage. Fermentation. Some communities fermented cabbage or grains for both nutrition and preservation. Meals to generate warmth. Winter meals were designed to fuel the body and maintain heat. Stews and pottages, thick stews, often containing barley, vegetables, and occasional meat, were slow cooked over the hearth. The hot broth warmed both body and home. Hot drinks, ale, small beer, weak beer, or broth were consumed regularly. Warm drinks provided comfort and hydration when water froze or was unsafe. Calorie-dense ingredients. Fat was prized. Butter, lard, and animal fat were scarce, but used strategically to increase caloric intake, essential for enduring cold nights. Challenges of winter nutrition, surviving the cold was more than eating, it was about combating scarcity. Food shortages. Harsh winters could destroy crops and prevent foraging, leading to hunger or famine. Nutritional deficiencies. Limited variety in diet led to scurvy, rickets, or other deficiencies. Labor and caloric needs. Peasants performed hard labor, plowing, chopping wood, tending animals, which demanded a high caloric intake just to maintain body heat.
Community sharing and cooperation. Peasants often relied on social bonds to survive. Shared meals. Neighbors sometimes pooled resources to ensure that the most vulnerable, children, widows, and the elderly, had enough to eat. Bartering and trade. Grains, eggs, and dairy were traded within villages or with traveling merchants to supplement scarce supplies. Winter nights demanded not only warmth, but also nourishment. The ability to store, prepare, and consume energy-rich foods determined whether a peasant household could survive until spring. Every stew, every loaf of bread, and every sip of ale was part of the strategy to endure the freezing months. Clothing and layering, fighting the cold from the outside. Surviving the bitter nights of medieval Britain required more than food. It required ingenious clothing strategies. Peasants didn't have luxury furs or velvet cloaks, but they knew how to layer, insulate, and adapt what little they had to survive freezing temperatures. Basic garments. Peasant clothing was simple, practical, and multi-purpose. Tunics and kittles were the basic outfit for both men and women. Made from wool or rough linen, tunics were long enough to cover the body but short enough to allow movement for work. Hosen and leg wrappings, men wore woolen hosen or wrapped strips of cloth around their legs for warmth. Women often layered long skirts with additional undergarments.
Cloaks and mantles. Thick wool cloaks, often fastened with a brooch, protected against wind and rain. A hood or cowl was indispensable during snowstorms. Layering techniques. Peasants mastered layering to trap heat. Multiple tunics. Wearing a thin linen underlayer beneath a wool tunic provided insulation and moisture management. Overlapping cloaks. Cloaks could be wrapped multiple times around the body, creating a makeshift quilt of warmth. Foot and hand protection. Woolen socks, wrapped leather boots, and gloves made from scraps or fur help prevent frostbite. Materials and insulation. Resources were limited, so peasants used what was available. Wool, the most common and effective material. Thick, coarse wool retained heat even when damp. Fur trimmings. Only the wealthy could afford full fur garments, but peasants sometimes added small scraps of rabbit or fox fur to key areas like collars or sleeves. Linen layers. Linen served as an inner layer to wick moisture away from the skin, keeping the body warmer. Adaptation to harsh weather. Peasants adapted their clothing not only for warmth, but for survival, reusing old garments. Torn clothing was patched, layered, or even used as extra insulation in beds. Hats and hoods. Head coverings were crucial. A surprising amount of body heat escapes from the head. Improvised accessories. Strips of cloth, animal pelts, or even straw could be added to gloves or boots to trap heat. Cultural and social implications. Clothing also reflected social status and function. Status signaling. Even among peasants, slight variations in wool quality or decoration could indicate wealth or skill. Functional over fashion. Survival trumped appearance. A patched tunic was valued more for warmth than style. By layering, repurposing materials, and prioritizing function, medieval peasants could endure nights that would be unbearable without careful preparation. Their clothing was not just apparel, it was armor against the cold, a tool for survival, and a testament to human ingenuity.
Sleeping arrangements, how peasants stayed warm at night. For medieval peasants, surviving the coldest nights was as much about where and how they slept as it was about clothing. Homes were small, drafty, and poorly insulated, so ingenuity became essential to stay alive when the temperature dropped. Peasant homes and layouts. Most peasants lived in one-room cottages, often built of wattle and daub with thatched roofs. Stone cottages existed but were rare due to cost. Key characteristics included central hearth, the main source of heat, often in the middle of the room. Cooking and warmth were centralized here. Earthen floors, dirt floors absorbed cold, so straw mats or rushes were spread to provide insulation. Minimal windows, small, shuttered openings helped keep drafts out, but also limited light. Sleeping surfaces. Beds were far from luxurious. Peasants often had to make do with straw mattresses or rush beds. Bundles of straw, hay, or rushes provided basic cushioning and insulation. Shared bedding. Families slept together to share body heat. In some cases, even animals like pigs or dogs were allowed inside for warmth. Layering blankets. Extra woolen cloaks, patched quilts, or furs were layered to trap heat. Heat conservation techniques. Peasants developed clever strategies to preserve warmth. Sleeping close to the hearth, the central fire provided residual heat, but smoke was a constant hazard. Curtains or partitions, hanging cloths around beds or corners of the room helped reduce drafts. Body heat sharing. Families huddled together, pressing close to share warmth during the coldest nights.
Clothing in bed. Even while sleeping, clothing was essential. Nightwear was layered. Thick tunics or extra cloaks were often kept on at night. Head and foot protection. Caps, hoods, socks, and wrappings helped prevent heat loss from extremities. Reusing daywear. The same clothing worn during the day often became sleepwear at night. Seasonal adjustments. Winter survival required adapting to prolonged cold. Straw insulation. Straw was replenished regularly to maintain warmth. Thick bedding in extreme cold. Extra blankets or furs were prized possessions. Huddling together. Close proximity was often more effective than fire alone, especially during blizzards or freezes. Medieval peasants did not just survive. They strategically used architecture, bedding, clothing, and family cooperation to endure nights that would have been fatal without careful planning. Their ingenuity was born out of necessity, turning humble cottages into small sanctuaries against the merciless winter. Food and drink, keeping warm from the inside. Surviving the coldest nights wasn't just about fire and bedding. What peasants ate and drank played a crucial role in maintaining body heat and energy during harsh winters. Their diets were simple, seasonal, and heavily influenced by what could be grown, stored, or preserved. Staples of the peasant diet, medieval peasants relied on humble foods that provided both calories and warmth. Porridges and gruels made from oats, barley, or rye, often boiled in water or thin milk. Porridge was filling and easy to digest before sleep. Bread, coarse dark bread made from whole grains, was a mainstay, often baked in communal ovens. Legumes and vegetables, beans, peas, cabbage, leeks, and root vegetables were common and could be stored through winter. Occasional meat. Meat was scarce. Peasants might eat salted pork, preserved fish, or the occasional rabbit, often saved for special occasions or added to stews. Warm drinks also contributed to heat. Ale, weak and low-alcohol beer, was safer than water and provided calories. Small children might also drink ale diluted with water. Broths made from bones, grains, or vegetables were nourishing and warming. Herbal infusions, simple teas from mint, chamomile, or nettle were used for warmth and health. Food and drink, keeping warm from the inside. Surviving the coldest nights wasn't just about fire and bedding. What peasants ate and drank played a crucial role in maintaining body heat and energy during harsh winters. Their diets were simple, seasonal, and heavily influenced by what could be grown, stored, or preserved. Staples of the peasant diet, medieval peasants relied on humble foods that provided both calories and warmth. Porridges and gruels made from oats, barley, or rye, often boiled in water or thin milk. Porridge was filling and easy to digest before sleep. Bread, coarse dark bread made from whole grains, was a mainstay, often baked in communal ovens. Legumes and vegetables, beans, peas, cabbage, leeks, and root vegetables were common and could be stored through winter. Occasional meat. Meat was scarce. Peasants might eat salted pork, preserved fish, or the occasional rabbit, often saved for special occasions or added to stews. Warm drinks also contributed to heat. Ale, weak and low-alcohol beer, was safer than water and provided calories. Small children might also drink ale diluted with water. Broths made from bones, grains, or vegetables were nourishing and warming. Herbal infusions, simple teas from mint, chamomile, or nettle were used for warmth and health. Fire and hearth, the heart of warmth.
For medieval peasants, the hearth was the central lifeline of a home during the bitterest nights. Unlike modern heating, survival depended entirely on the proper use of fire, both for warmth and cooking. The hearth as a home center. In most medieval peasant homes, the hearth was a simple stone or clay structure, often located in the middle of the main living space. Its importance cannot be overstated. Warmth, the hearth radiated heat in every direction. Families slept as close as possible without risk of burns. Cooking. Stews, porridge, and broths were prepared over open flames or in iron pots. Fuel sources. Maintaining a fire required careful management of available fuel. Wood, the primary fuel. Forest access determined how long fires could burn. Peat. In areas without abundant trees, dried peat served as an alternative. Dung and crop residue. In desperate times, dried animal dung or straw was used. It burned quickly but provided temporary warmth. Peasants often stacked wood strategically, keeping dried pieces near the hearth for easy access during the night.
Fire maintenance. The cold nights demanded constant attention to fire. Banking the fire, covering embers with ash overnight allowed the fire to last longer. Layered burning, adding small sticks gradually, prevented sudden flare-ups while keeping steady warmth. Fire safety. Peasants had to balance warmth with caution. Homes were made of timber and thatch, highly flammable materials. Bedding and insulation, fighting the cold in straw and wool. When night fell, peasants faced biting cold with limited resources. Their survival depended on clever use of bedding, clothing, and insulation. Straw mattresses and bedding. Most peasants slept on simple straw-stuffed mattresses or mats placed on wooden platforms or directly on the floor. Straw as insulation. Dry straw provided a layer between the cold floor and the body, trapping heat. Layering. Families often shared beds, layering straw and blankets for added warmth. Maintenance. Straw had to be replaced regularly. Damp or moldy straw made the nights unbearable. Blankets and furs. Blankets were rare and precious. Woolen cloth. Those who could afford it used woolen blankets or cloaks, often passed down or patched together from scraps. Animal skins, sheep or goat skins added crucial insulation. Peasants sometimes slept on them or wrapped themselves inside. Shared warmth. Entire families huddled together under whatever covering was available, conserving body heat collectively.
Clothing for sleep. Even in bed, peasants remained fully clothed. Layered linen and wool, underclothes for hygiene, wool layers for warmth, hoods and caps, head coverings prevented heat loss. Up to 30% of body heat could escape through the head. Socks and leg wraps. Feet were wrapped in cloth or thin leather to prevent frostbite. Home insulation. Peasant homes themselves were crude but functional. Thick wattling daub walls provided some wind protection. Curtains and hangings, cloth or animal hides over doorways reduced drafts. Tightly packed straw floors, not only bedding but added thermal insulation for the entire home. Survival mindset. Enduring the cold was as much mental as physical. Peasants learned to ration warmth, avoid drafts, and huddle together. Every small adaptation, stacking straw, keeping the hearth alive, layering clothing, meant the difference between surviving the night or succumbing to frost. Diet, nighttime meals, and winter calorie management. As darkness fell and the cold crept into every corner of a medieval peasant's home, the stomach's grumble became as pressing as the chill. Survival wasn't just about insulation, it was about fueling the body with enough calories to endure long, freezing nights. The importance of winter calories. During the harshest months, peasants needed to eat more than usual. Extra fat and carbohydrates, fat provided long-lasting energy, bread, grains, and porridge offered warmth from inside. Slow digestion. Heavier meals allowed the body to generate sustained heat while sleeping. Timing. Some peasants ate late meals just before bed to maximize warmth during sleep. Typical nighttime foods. Night meals were simple but functional. Porridge and gruel, made from oats, barley, or rye, often cooked with water or a little milk. Salt, herbs, or honey added flavor when available. Preserved meats. Dried or salted meats eaten sparingly supplemented calories during long winters. Vegetables. Root vegetables like turnips, parsnips, and onions were stored in cellars and cooked slowly for nutrition and warmth. Beverages for warmth. Hot drinks were essential for warming the body. Ale or weak beer, safer than water, providing both hydration and mild calories. Herbal infusions. Some used herbs like mint, thyme, or chamomile for warmth and digestive aid. Milk, when available, was consumed warm for extra calories. Rationing and sharing. Family units. In households, food was shared carefully to ensure everyone survived. Elders and children often ate last. Stretching meals. One pot of gruel could serve an entire family, cooked slowly over the hearth and eaten in small portions. Psychological edge. Eating wasn't just nourishment, it was ritual and comfort. A hot meal signaled security amidst winter storms. Even the poorest peasants understood the importance of warmth from the inside out.
A meal could stave off despair as well as cold. Peasants mastered a delicate balance, fueling the body efficiently while managing scarce resources, ensuring that each night, even the coldest, could be survived. Hearth fires, nighttime heating, and family survival strategies. As the final piece in understanding how medieval peasants survived the coldest nights, we turn to the hearth, the beating heart of the home. In the freezing winter months, warmth was life itself, and its management required skill, ingenuity, and cooperation among family members. The hearth central to survival. The hearth was more than a place to cook. It was the primary source of heat, light, and social cohesion. Location, typically at the center of the dwelling, ensuring maximum heat dispersion. Construction, made from stone or clay, designed to contain and radiate heat. Fuel, peasants burned wood, peat, or dried dung, carefully rationed for efficiency.
Fire maintenance. Keeping a fire alive overnight was crucial. Night embers were banked with ashes to slow their cooling, allowing them to reignite quickly in the morning. Fuel management. Firewood was split and dried in advance. Damp wood was avoided as it produced smoke but little warmth. Safety concerns. Fires were small but strategic. Open flames posed a danger in straw-thatched homes. Sleeping arrangements. Survival dependent on body heat and insulation. Communal sleeping. Families often slept together in one room, huddled to conserve warmth. Straw mattresses. Beds were filled with straw or rushes. Additional layers were sometimes added for insulation. Clothing at night. Woolen garments and blankets were worn while sleeping. Even layers of hay helped trap heat. Nighttime habits for warmth. Peasants developed routines to endure freezing nights. Proximity to fire. The youngest and weakest slept closest to the hearth. Shared body heat. Adults curled around children or elderly family members to conserve warmth. Hot stones and water. Heated stones were placed near bedding, and small pots of hot water were sometimes used for localized warmth.
Psychological and community support. Survival was as much mental as physical. Stories and songs, families huddled together sharing tales to pass the long nights. Shared responsibilities, children and adults rotated tending the fire, fetching wood, and preparing small meals. Community networks. Villagers helped one another, sharing firewood or inviting neighbors into slightly warmer spaces during extreme cold. Lessons from the hearth. The medieval peasant's home was a carefully orchestrated system of warmth, ration, and human ingenuity. Each ember, each layer of straw, and each huddled body represented a delicate balance between survival and the merciless winter outside. The hearth was not just a fire, it was a lifeline, a symbol of human endurance, and a stage upon which families enacted strategies honed over generations to survive nights that could freeze the very soul.